which is an excellent daily source of articles about politics and policy in North Carolina, as well as summaries of national news and editorials. Rob is a lawyer and a journalist and a longtime observer of the shenanigans of North Carolina politicians. As such, he is going to talk to us tonight about the anticipated consequences in the North Carolina General Assembly after the 2022 elections. Rob Schofield and his computer.
Thank you, Vicki, very, very much. And to all of you, thank you so much for coming out. Oh, here I am banging into the microphone on a winter's night in January. You know, it's easy sometimes to I get this way. I'm sure you all do. You get sort of cynical and sober in these times we inhabit. You can think, oh, what's the point of my doing this, that kind of stuff. But you can't give in to that. It makes an enormous difference that you come to events like this, that you continue to speak out, that you remain active, that you take care of yourselves, that you stay in the fight, that we not surrender. This is the life's blood of our democracy, the kind of work you're doing in this group. Vicki's told me that it's not just a club in which we come here talks. It's also an activist group that's trying and doing great work to affirmatively improve our planet. So congratulations on that. Thank you for letting me be a part of it tonight. I'm honored to be with you. My name is Rob Schofield, and I've left my glasses somewhere, so hold on one second. And it's good to be with everybody that's on Zoom as well. I know we all spend a lot of our lives on Zoom these days. I love that Geico commercial where they're all talking over each other on the little gecko, and that's my life a lot of days as well. I know you all are familiar with that. A lot of big issues I want to talk to you about tonight, the state of our state and our nation, and I want to have some time for Q&A, and there's a lot of really important stuff. I want to take a few minutes, though, just to tell you a little bit more, if you don't know, about NC Policy Watch. Although I am a lifelong Democrat, and I've always said, you can tell because I've always said I'm not a member of any organized party. I've always been a Democrat. NC Policy Watch is a nonpartisan organization, is part of a 501c3 nonpartisan organization, and we're proud of that fact because we do give Democrats hell when they do the wrong thing. We are standing up for the truth as best we can. Policy Watch has had an interesting history. It was started really, gosh, almost 20 years ago now by Chris Fitzsimons. Some of you may remember Chris. Chris was a very prominent media voice in our state, really still is in some sense. And Chris hired me in 2006. I had been an attorney for many years at a group called the North Carolina Justice Center, working on anti-poverty issues, going to the General Assembly, representing low-income consumers and victims of domestic violence. And Chris hired me as his second commentator. Chris was really a one-man shop. And then we actually came up with the great idea about 3 or 4 years later. It's been 12, 13 years now, that with the rapidly diminishing news media environment, even then it was starting to happen. Our traditional newspapers were starting to contract and collapse. And, you know, what had once been a very robust press room over at the General Assembly was becoming, you know, sort of empty. He came up with the bright idea that we could fund nonprofit journalism in this state and do a much better job of it and fill in at least some of those gaps that have been created by the demise of traditional news media outlets. And so we started raising money from national funders, principally from state funders as well, to turn NC Policy Watch from what had been really just a commentary shop into a bona fide nonprofit newsroom. And it succeeded. The first person we hired, the first investigative reporter we hired was a woman named Sarah Ovaska, who had worked for the Raleigh News and Observer. And it was her reporting that sent a prominent Republican state lawmaker to federal prison for corruption. And that really sort of made our mark. And since that time, the national funders said, Chris, this is great. Do more of this. They helped us hire more people. And then in 2017, sort of to my shock, they came to Chris and said, do this everywhere, do this across the country. And Chris sort of left me running NC Policy Watch. He's over here in Chapel Hill now running a national news network called States Newsroom. You can find him at statesnewsroom.com. There are going on 30 outlets, state capital-based news outlets based really upon our model, which is pretty cool. He was telling me today they open in Alabama in 2 weeks. They've got tremendous outlets in Virginia and Kentucky and Michigan and Nevada and Arizona, all across the country, headed towards really complete coverage of the country. They also have a dynamic Washington, D.C. News bureau with some veteran D.C. hands who are providing us with news coverage all the time of what's going on in Washington. So we've really, I started out as a do-gooder lawyer. I used to be a lobbyist for the American Civil Liberties Union. I was an anti-poverty lawyer. I'm not sure I really envisioned myself becoming the head of a journalism organization, but that's what I do now. I guess I've made that transition, and I've got a great team of journalists who work for us at NC Policy Watch. We've got really a pretty darn impressive team. Lisa Sorg, who's going to be your speaker here in March, right? Is that right, Vicki? Lisa is one of the best environmental reporters in the entire nation. Last year, she received the National Press Foundation Award for her expose on this decrepit missile factory in Alamance County. She is the person who has single-handedly really exposed the deeply flawed response to hurricane rebuilding that's been taking place in the state over the last few years. It's one of the real unfortunate mistakes that the Cooper administration has made. And Lisa has really single-handedly held that up to the light of day. The fact that there are literally people who lost their homes in Hurricane Matthew and Florence 5, 6, 7 years ago, who are still living in motels, in lousy one-star motels. They're stuff sitting in these dreadful boxes outside their decaying homes. And the fact that our state has done such a lousy job of getting people back into their homes as they promised to do has just been really, and it's been her single-handed reporting that has brought that to light. And she does that every day. I just edited a story by her today that'll run tomorrow morning about methane emissions at a Sampson County landfill that are just remarkable. The size of it, it's the second largest landfill emitter of methane in the country. It's an important story. We've got Greg Childress, who worked for years with the Durham Herald-Sun. Greg is our education reporter. He's done a great job of covering controversy surrounding the Leandro education lawsuit. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Charter schools, voucher schools. We've got Joe Killian, who is former political reporter for the Greensboro News and Record many years ago. Joe came to us, gosh, now it's been 5, 6 years. Joe broke the story of Nicole Hannah-Jones, the journalist at UNC Chapel Hill who was chased away because of her politics by some influential conservative donors. Nicole's getting her revenge now. She's got a great gig. She's got a new TV show. She's kind of become a national star. But she took Joe into her confidence, and he broke that story. He had all of the insights on that. He's really carried that on. He is the preeminent higher education reporter in the state. He's covering what's going on over at the Board of Governors. We've got Lynn Bonner, who spent 25 years at the News and Observer covering state politics and state government. She's one of the people courageous, one of the few reporters courageous now to keep going to the legislative building, not only because you're worried about COVID, but just because you're worried about being in the legislative building. And Lynn is, she had 2 stories for us yesterday. One was just a profile of the makeup of the new General Assembly. So if you're not too familiar with what it looks like, you could check that out on our website. Again, ncpolicywatch.com. She also had a story in the afternoon about the fact that as many as 300,000 people in North Carolina, we already don't insure a lot of people who are low-income working people because we haven't expanded Medicaid. There's another 300,000 who've gotten health coverage because of emergency COVID policies that are now set to lose that in a couple months. And she has a story on that as well. And we've hired this dynamic young reporter. I'm really excited about this young guy. His name is Kellen Lyons. He comes to us from an outlet called the Connecticut Mirror. And Kellen just joined us last summer, but I just helped him get off to a rental car today to drive off to Asheville. He's covering a trial that's taking place tomorrow morning in Buncombe County courts, where a pair of journalists were actually arrested because they were covering the dispersal of a homeless camp. And, you know, Asheville's got a lot of problems with homelessness, but the police decided that they would arrest the journalists taking photos and video of the event as well. Obviously a huge issue for press freedom. Kellen's going to be covering that. He's written already a series of stories about North Carolina's deeply challenged correction system, the fact that our prisons remain understaffed and really barbaric in many circumstances. Same for our juvenile justice system and our court system in general, so badly underfunded. So Kellen will be writing a lot about that. But I'm really proud that I get to go to work with these people every day and edit their stories and help them figure out what they're going to do next. And we've got a lot of great news stories coming for you in the coming days and weeks. So I just wanted to let you know about Policy Watch, and let's see if I can make this computer work. Yeah, we've gone on over the, we also, of course, do have, as I mentioned, the Washington DC Bureau, lots of great stories there. We'll have some coverage tomorrow morning about the response in Washington to the latest horrific shootings in California, as well as more information about yet another discovery, of course, of documents, classified documents. This time it's former Vice President Pence. I think just about everyone in Washington now, it turns out, has classified documents in their garage. So that'll be a fascinating story. But so there's lots of topics I'd like to talk about tonight. Maybe I'll start with a bit of a roundup just to remind folks where we are. I know some folks, maybe you're new to North Carolina, don't know all the details of how our General Assembly works and what the situation is there. Y'all may not know, we have, and this was new to me when I came to North Carolina 30 years ago, we have elections for every seat in the legislature every 2 years. It's not like states where the Senate maybe has a 4 or 6 year term. Here it's everybody's up every 2 years, 50 members in the Senate, 120 in the House. When I arrived in 1992, they made the Republicans sit in the back row. There were like 10 of them in the Senate out of the 50 senators. Now that's not to say that there was a robust leftist majority in the legislature. This was a different time, of course, and we all know that the Democratic Party has gone through a lot of transformations in North Carolina, just as the Republican Party has. It was a very different place, but we had a tremendously progressive Speaker of the House, a guy by the name of Dan Blue, who at that time was a young, dynamic lawyer from Raleigh, and is this now maybe a late middle-aged dynamic lawyer from Raleigh, and is the Senate Minority Leader, actually. So it was a different place in those times, but I still remember us having battles and thinking, gosh, that conservative Jim Hunt over there in the governor's office, he's so difficult to deal with. You know, it's like, my God, times have changed, right? So today we have, as I said, 170 members in the Senate. As you probably are aware now, as a result of the 2022 election, there is a 30-20 Republican majority in the Senate, which gives them the required 3/5 majority to override a gubernatorial veto. And in the House, the margin is 71-49, and they need 72 votes to override a gubernatorial veto. So that means that things are hanging pretty much by a thread. Now, Governor Cooper, since the Democrats broke the old supermajorities in the 2018 elections, been able to hold on to all of his vetoes. But I think there's a great deal of concern that this coming session, that's going to be very difficult to do. But it's important to remember that the 2022 election, y'all, I'm sure, were very active in it. I know, I'm told Chatham County had like the highest turnout. There were a lot of good things that happened in the 2022 election for people who care about progressive causes. There was of course, a great deal of existential concern that things were just going to be Armageddon, that things were going to go terribly south at all levels of government, certainly in Washington. And as it turned out, that didn't happen. And indeed, in a lot of states, Democrats did very well. The president's party, the Democrats, did better than the president's party has done in any such off-year election in like 40 years. And I think that's a testament to President Joe Biden. You know, I'm a big defender of Joe Biden's, actually. I know he's not the most sexy guy or the most dynamic person, and he's clearly, you know, getting up there a little bit. But I mean, he's had a remarkably effective presidency thus far. It's just been 2 years, just 2 years last Friday, right? Only halfway through. Is a remarkable list of accomplishments when you think about where our country was with an insurrection and literally thousands of people dying a day from COVID, and our economy in tatters, and our foreign policy, just this horrific embarrassment to our country that we were no longer a defender of democracy. The list of where our country was just 2 years ago and where it is today there's been a remarkable turnaround. I give him a lot of credit for that. He hasn't been perfect. He's made some mistakes, no doubt. But when you compare that to where we were, you know, just a short time ago, it's amazing how short the memories and how that Americans tend to have about their politicians. It's very much a "what have you done for me lately" kind of thing. So, but the 2022 elections produced a lot of, you know, good results. Of course, one of the most heartening being that across the country, people stood up for reproductive freedom. That, you know, there was very much a feeling that, and we still have huge challenges there, but voters really made clear, even in deeply red states, that they didn't want to go backwards on that. We you know, here in North Carolina, although things Could have been better. They could have been a lot worse. And we saw really the continued impact of gerrymandering and how noxious and how toxic that continues to be in our state, because the classic poster child for all that is what happened in the congressional election, where we had reasonably fair maps finally drawn under court order. Here we are, a 50-50 purple state. What the heck? What happened? 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans elected to Congress in the U.S. House in North Carolina. Where gerrymandering still prevailed, like in the state legislature, not so much the case. And it's true, it's a little harder to draw maps when the districts are very small like that, to draw very fair districts. But let's not kid ourselves. Gerrymandering is the reason that the Republicans have such an enormous majority in the General Assembly. So it remains an enormous issue that we're going to have to talk about more and more. And as I said, the whole issue of vetoes is going to continue to be a discussion in the new year. It's also important to remember, I think, to remind ourselves that, again, just the demise of Trumpism. Obviously, it's not completely gone. He remains this sort of lurking cancer on our society. But, I think there's this feeling of optimism that maybe we've gotten past the worst of that wave. So where are we now here in the North Carolina General Assembly and in government in North Carolina? It's a tough situation. We are about to start, or we really technically already started, the long session of the General Assembly. Again, when I came here in 1992, we had a very different situation. The legislature actually came in for the long session, the first year of the biennium. They came in January, they did their business, they tried to pass the budget by the start of the fiscal year on July 1, and they generally did, and then they went home, and we didn't see them again, except for occasional meetings until the following spring. The so-called short session started in the second year of the biennium. Lawmakers would return in the spring, maybe stay for 6 or 8 weeks, make adjustments to the budget, deal with a few bills that were left over from the previous session and maybe that had been recommended by a study commission, and that was that. And then they went home again. We have a part-time legislature here where legislators are paid $13,000 a year. That wasn't perhaps an unreasonable situation. That's changed, and especially over the last decade under Republican control. Republicans, of course, won in the 2010 election, immediately redrew the maps to sort of gerrymander things to their tremendous advantage, and have proceeded over the last 12 years really to make enormous changes to our state government, to how it runs, to the laws, to the way we fund essential services and structures, and to the way we run the General Assembly. They have effectively made it kind of like a full-time gig. It's never quite clear when we're in session. The sessions kind of come and go. They ebb and flow. They can technically be in session, but don't ask any Democrats whether they're going to hold a vote or whether they're, when a bill might come up. I think the powers that be, the Republican leader, Senate Leader Berger and House Speaker Tim Moore have, they play hardball, and they figured out it's to their advantage to keep everybody back on their heels and not knowing exactly what's going to happen. So that's probably how this coming session is going to go. They'll probably be in and out of session all year, is my expectation. Obviously, there are an array of incredibly important issues that will be front and center during this session. As I said, there are some issues we know that'll come up because in the past the governor vetoed them, and then they were unable to override those. So there's an expectation that there will be new attempts on some of those issues. And obviously topping the list is abortion rights. North Carolina is right now effectively a sanctuary state, although we have our own unnecessary and destructive restrictions on abortion rights in the state, a 20-week limitation, 72-hour waiting period, all kinds of reporting that's unnecessary and just invasive towards doctors and pregnant people. We remain, compared to most of course, the Confederacy, the old Confederacy, a very progressive state still, and there are tons of pregnant people coming to North Carolina in search of abortion services. And so that's hanging, as we say, by a thread. Now, it's been interesting. Obviously, there are some true believing theocrats in the General Assembly who are ready to, state that life begins at conception and any action to alter that is murder. I don't think anybody expects that that's going to be where we're going to go, but there's a real committed hardcore right wing, just as we experienced recently in Washington, right? With the vote in the US House, there's a group of lawmakers like that in the North Carolina House and Senate. President Pro Tem Berger has actually who usually, is sort of the voice of reaction on so many issues on this, has sort of made comments about, well, I think maybe it should be limited to the first trimester, which would be terrible. There's no explanation for it. There's no rationale behind it that makes any particular sense, but perhaps that's an indication that they will not try for the most extreme kind of bans that we've seen in other states, Georgia, Ohio, South Carolina. But it's going to be just a pitched battle, and every vote is going to count. It's going to be very close. We've had situations in the past in which Democrats have, for various reasons, sometimes inexplicable, voted for things to go along with the Republicans, but then when the time came to sustain a gubernatorial veto, they've been willing to stick with the governor. So I think that's still possible. We know, however, there are some Democratic members who are not pro-choice, or at least not, strongly pro-choice. So it's going to be, it's an issue I've worked on for the last 35 years of my life. And I feel very troubled about the reality of what we face in our state. And I think it would be a great tragedy if we go down that road. I still think there's a chance to hold on. And I urge you all to stay engaged in that discussion. Another issue, maybe a more hopeful issue for the 2023 session, is Medicaid expansion. Y'all may have heard, probably have heard, if you've ever seen anything I've written, you've heard about it, that for the last decade, our state has been literally condemning thousands of people to an early death each year by not expanding Medicaid, as has been done now by 39 other states. There's no good explanation for it other than sheer right-wing anti-government ideology, the fact that it's socialized medicine. God forbid that we would somehow provide healthcare to low-income working people who can't otherwise afford it. But literally, the statistics are clear that we are losing thousands of people unnecessarily per year because they are uninsured. We're losing billions and billions of dollars that could be coming from the federal government to pay for it, because the federal government would pay for 95% of it. All the economic activity that would produce, all the sustainability and stability in our particularly rural healthcare systems that would produce. And of course, the great irony there is that it's the Republican lawmakers who generally represent the areas that are hardest hit by the failure to expand Medicaid. We know there are 14,000 veterans in our state who would benefit from Medicaid expansion. All in all, well over 500,000 people. It's been done in, as I say, 39 other states. It's been uniformly a success. It's not perfect, but it's a tremendous thing. The weird thing, of course, is that the Republicans, by and large, have now agreed to this. They've come along. Senate President Berger now says he has finally realized that the numbers are there, that it's indisputable, that it would be beneficial to the state. We've had a lot of Republicans who've been saying that for a long time. But now it's been caught up with other issues. They're trying to inject other debates into the topic, things about certificate of need laws and profitability of hospitals and, doctor hospital battles over controls of practices and things like that. So it's going to be, I think there is still real hope that maybe finally at long last, this will be the year. It may not be perfect. It would be ideal if we could just do a clean Medicaid expansion bill. But I do think if we had a vote and nobody was required to do what their party leader told them to do, that it would pass both houses and Governor Cooper would sign it. I wrote a column over Christmas saying that was my Christmas wish for Cooper, was that he'd get to sign this bill finally before he leaves the governorship 2 years from now. The other big issue that we need to talk about is Leandro, which is the school funding case that's been outstanding in this state now for 29 years since it was first filed. Supreme Court first decided it in 1997, reiterated it in 2004, saying that North Carolina school children, it was filed by 5 very low wealth counties that said we just can't raise the money to fund our schools. The state Supreme Court ruled multiple times that the children of our state have a constitutional right to a sound basic education, which includes, adequate staffing, good teachers, good principals, the basic things that you would have in a good public school system. Just last year, the state Supreme Court ordered the General Assembly to do it. For the first time, they finally, it was like fish or cut bait time. They said, dadgummit, you guys got to do this. And they ordered them to comply with a comprehensive plan that had been developed by the trial court in the case. It contemplates the spending of several $1 billion over the next several years. So far, the Republican legislatures just refused to do it. They've spent about half of what was required for the first year. It has the potential to be a constitutional crisis. We'll see. We have a new Supreme Court, however, as y'all are well aware, and that may have an impact on the outcome there. But that's something that, from my perspective, if the court cannot direct the legislature to spend this money, then what's the point of having this lawsuit? What's the point of having a Supreme Court if it can't direct the General Assembly to spend the money to comply with the Constitution? It's a toothless Constitution if that can't happen. But it's the argument of the Republican lawmakers that this is purely their bailiwick, that the courts have no role to say when it comes to appropriating funds. That's exclusively reserved to the General Assembly. So we'll see how this comes out. That's clearly going to be another issue. Greg Childress had a story to say on that today, I guess it was, at NC Policy Watch, that explains that actually in bipartisan fashion, the State Board of Education endorsed this idea. The Republican state superintendent, Catherine Truitt, who basically gets her marching orders from the legislature, has been notably silent. It'll be another fight. And the last thing I'll say about spending money in the General Assembly, I know I'm getting long here and going, I want to have time for questions. Well, an important fact to remember, we all hear about taxes. Taxes are always rising. Taxes are a burden on our society. It's such a burden to pay taxes. Here's the truth about state and local taxes in North Carolina. Now, most people, if you've come here from another state, particularly from the Northeast, you already know we have pretty low taxes. As a percentage of our economy, as a share of our total economy, our state is now spending about 40% less than it did a dozen years ago when Republicans took over. Think about that. If we had just left taxes where they were, and at that time, Site Selection magazine and all the industrial recruiters were saying, this is a #1 state for business. Come to North Carolina. It's a great place for business. This was when Bev Perdue was governor. The Democrats were running things. Mike Easley. If we just left taxes where they were then, we would literally have tens of billions of dollars that we would have had to spend over the last several years on core public structures and services. And what a shock. People are not very happy with the performance of our public schools these days. They're not very happy with our roads. They're not very happy with our court system, with our prisons, with you name it, the public structures and systems in our state that are struggling. It comes down to the fact that we're just cheapskates. We're not spending the money that's necessary to get the job done. It's not that we have to have the Rolls Royce, but we've got sort of a Yugo system working right now, when we could at least have maybe a Honda or something like that. It's a startling statistic when you look at those numbers. The NC Budget and Tax Center, which is, you can find them at ncbudget.org, and that's a group I helped start many, many years ago, has documented a lot of the data around those numbers, and it's worth checking out. So a couple of minutes left. I guess that I'll to say about the upcoming legislative session. There are, of course, an array of issues that we all are seeing in the news headlines every day: the climate emergency, gun violence, the minimum wage, immigration reform. That's another issue where Governor Cooper's vetoes have been sustained, where they've wanted to get require sheriffs to get in the business of enforcing immigration law. Obviously, LGBTQ equality. There'll be another push for a "Don't Say Gay" law in the, a la Ron DeSantis in Florida when it comes to our schools. There's still talk about actual medical marijuana progressing in North Carolina this year. I think there's a good chance of that. We'll probably see a renewed push for legalized sports gambling, which I would be happy to debate with anybody and have a lot of deep concerns about the wisdom of that. It's one issue where I think maybe some of the folks on the religious right actually have some good thoughts. So there's a lot that's going to be happening this session. North Carolina remains at heart a deeply purple state, but I know it's frustrating because that's not represented in our actual elected officials, but it's going to happen eventually if people stick with it. A time will come at which we will have an election that will change things, and then we can get hopefully redistricting reform passed that brings about nonpartisan redistricting and a chance to have reasonably fair districts in our state. So there's so much to do, so many important causes, so many issues, but I hope you'll check out NC Policy Watch and continue to inform yourselves on them. And if you have things to say, if you have suggestions for us for stories we should be covering, if you yourself wants to write an op-ed that perhaps we could publish for you, I started out as a do-gooder lawyer, and now I run a news organization that's basically a competitor of the News and Observer and WRAL. Who'd have thunk it? But it's pretty exciting. And so we are really excited. We have something like 50,000 people who get our stories every week, just via email. We know that hundreds of thousands more read them when they're republished in other news outlets and online, and on social media. So check us out. And do we have time for questions, Vicki, if folks may have some? I guess we're going to have a microphone go around the room. Right here in front. Yeah.
Thank you. You've mentioned many issues
I know, I'm sorry.
that concern me. I mean, it's hard to pick and choose. However, my major concern has been women's issues, and in particular, the right for a woman to have control of her own body. Now, I would like to see a ballot issue in this state, because in very conservative states, ballot issues have been surprisingly in favor of women's rights. And this goes a lot deeper than just abortions. This reflects upon how a woman is regarded as a human being, as a full person who has the rights that other human beings have. And I am very discouraged. And when you mention in passing the women's issues, you did not mention that there are lots of women and men in this state and in this country that agree with this. And when it goes on the ballot, they should be able to focus their anger and do something about it.
Our sister sibling outfit, the Kansas Reflector, had comprehensive coverage of the ballot initiative that took place in Kansas this past year. And it was so inspiring when, Kansas, we think really conservative, rock rib Republican, deeply red state, 60-40 in favor of preserving the right to an abortion in that state. I think you're absolutely right. The problem, of course, is that we are not a ballot initiative state. The only ballot initiatives that we vote on are the ones that the General Assembly places on the ballot. We're not a state in which citizens can can do it on their own. So that's the problem. It's sort of a catch-22. I'd love to see ballot initiatives in the state on, say, the minimum wage, or on, climate crisis, or probably about 10 other issues. There's probably some I'd rather not see on the ballot. But that's the problem. I think the voters, clearly public opinion is pro-choice, pro-reproductive freedom, but we have a legislature that's determined for the time being to prevent that from being realized. In the back there.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on her comments. First of all, I have been distressed for 20 plus years that the Democratic Party has allowed itself to be called the party for abortion. We are not a party. People aren't for abortion. They're really for the right for a woman to choose. But one of the things I find distressing as I listen to NPR, the NewsHour on PBS, is these Republicans who are for the right to life, but nobody asks them about, are they supporting any programs, Medicaid being one, to make sure that after children are born, that they are taken care of. So they're not for expansion of Medicaid. They're not concerned with pre and postnatal care. They're not concerned with decent education, et cetera. And I would like to see your organization begin to ask these legislators what they're going to do to care for these children. What I hear some of them say is, we're going to love them. And it makes me want to throw up, because love isn't enough. And I would like to know how many of our Republican legislators that want to reduce the right to a woman to choose are prepared to adopt these children. I would like to see them really be put on the spot about policies to support these children after they're born.
We actually do our best to ask those questions. I've written columns about it. One of the interesting phenomenon that's happened over the last 4 to 5 years is there's, with the sort of unfortunate identification of news media outlets as being partisan. I'm proudly nonpartisan, but I know I have a reputation as a progressive, and that's how many legislators see it. They just won't return our calls. They won't talk to us. Just as increasingly, they won't even talk to the Washington Post or the New York Times. So a lot of the conservative lawmakers have made a decision just not to answer that question. They have been asked that question. I've listened to myriad debates on the floor of the General Assembly in which very compelling Democratic lawmakers have made that very same plea, that very same speech, and it mostly falls on deaf ears. This is obviously something that's going on across the country. Another interesting phenomenon that's related to that, I think that we hope to be doing some investigations on in the coming years, are the phenomena of these so-called crisis pregnancy centers. Y'all are aware that our state gives millions of dollars each year to these so-called crisis pregnancy centers. What's increasingly becoming apparent is that they don't really do much. They don't, they see some unfortunate people who are confused enough to walk through their doors because they don't understand where they're going. They may think they're actually seeking abortion services. What's increasingly becoming apparent is that these centers are, in many instances, front organizations, or they are part of a network of sort of laundering funds. They come from state. Texas is going to give something like $100 million to these places soon. And then it finds its way out into the right-wing ecosystem of journalism outlets and social media outlets. It's an interesting, we don't know all the details yet. It's a story we'll be looking into, but I think it bespeaks the fact that there's a lack of honesty to the movement that you've highlighted on the other side in terms of the anti-choice movement. It's not, ultimately, I don't really think it is about right to life. I think it's about right to control other people's lives and the history of misogynism in our country. And so, yes, ultimately. So anyway, I hear exactly what you say. I appreciate it. And we will renew in our next staff meeting conversations about how we can continue to lift that up. I appreciate the reminder.
As citizens, you can also contact Mr. Hudson and ask him what he's going to do, or anyway, your local.
They'll pay lip service to things like abortion, to adoption services and things like that. But when it comes to actually protecting fully fledged, actual human life, that's rarely a top priority. Yes, ma'am, in the back, sure.
Thank you. I'm really interested in your reflections on the state of journalism. You are, honestly, I don't read a lot of newspapers. Is this better? Yeah, okay. I don't read a lot of newspapers, but I do know that, the News and Observer that is delivered to our house every day, has shrunk over the last 2 decades. And I know that you have an outlet, which is a progressive outlet for news.
Commentary is, yeah.
Uh-huh.
The news stories that we write we pride ourselves in abiding by journalistic ethics. And I don't want to interrupt you, but yeah, you're right. The demise of the traditional, of the so-called, what we now refer to as the legacy news media, that's a term that we sort of use to describe it, is a great tragedy. Like most of you, I'm old enough to remember when we all watched, Brinkley and Huntley and Walter Cronkite every night, and pretty much everybody got their news from a handful of trusted, honest, respected sources. And that really was, in many ways, a very healthy state of affairs for our country, because those journalists took their jobs very seriously, were scrupulously even-handed and honest. And, it really is a tragedy that has gone away. Of course, there were times also, it's worth reminding ourselves, there were times in previous eras in the United States in which we had yellow journalism. We had journalism that was unabashedly dishonest and paranoid and partisan. So it's not unprecedented that we've sort of had a resurrection of that. I'm at least somewhat encouraged by the rise of organizations like ours, not just ours, but other nonprofit news media outlets that do take real journalism seriously, and continue to have their stories find their way into outlets that people consume. It's also, of course, we're all struggling with the dilemma of just the fire hose of, at the same time that the traditional outlets have gone away, we're getting inundated with 9,000 emails a day and 100,000 tweets and Facebook posts, and it's very, very difficult. And I'm not sure there's a great solution to it. We just take the position, though, that it can't hurt to continue to produce really good stuff in as large a volume as we can and hope that a lot of people consume it. And for now, that's what we're going to try to do, and continue to work with other rising nonprofit news outlets across North Carolina, I'm happy to report, who are trying to do some of the same. And I was talking the other day, there's an outfit in Asheville called the Asheville Watchdog. And the Asheville Watchdog is basically founded by retired, it's like a bunch of Pulitzer Prize winners who all retired to Asheville and are like bored. And so they started their own news outlet, and it's amazing. They're doing some great work. And Lynn Bonnermeyer, one of our reporters, called the other day to see if she could work together with one of their reporters on a story. So, little inklings of good news out there, but it is a tough situation. I think Ted here in the front wanted to ask a question. She's going to bring you the microphone, Ted. He's had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, thank you. I don't see anything happening in this state until we get the Democrats in control. I don't believe that they're going to pass the Medicare. I just don't believe them.
Yeah.
And I think the Democratic Party in this state has done a miserable job. Two quick examples. Beasley, she was campaigning in Farrington.
Mhm.
There was no reason for her to campaign here. She should have been out in the western part of the county and the western counties of the state, because this part of Chatham County went all for her.
Yeah.
Same thing happened with Kay Hagan when she ran.
Second time, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really discouraging, and I'm really down on the state party in this state.
Political parties in general, I mean, we've had a transformation in our country, right? In which political parties have really struggled. I mean, I think it's true of the Republicans as well. We're trying to figure out how we organize ourselves politically in this society. A lot of it, I'm not here to defend the Democratic Party, as I say, I'm a nonpartisan commentator, but a lot of what's been, you can't underestimate just the tides that people are swimming against, or the environment. A few percentage points here or there in a different election, and all of a sudden it makes everything look great. It makes everything that they did look good. I mean, I thought Beasley, to a certain extent, I admired the fact that she was willing to go everywhere. I know it's interesting to hear that she was here. Maybe she had to raise money, but she was also, she tried to follow Obama's plan from 2008, which was just to go everywhere, to go to counties that are deeply red, on the theory that, well, if I get a bigger Democratic turnout, we get 30% of the vote instead of 20% of the vote, that all counts in a statewide race. I thought she actually did a pretty good job for someone who was in a really tough spot in an election that was just baked in to favor her opponent. But I'm sure the Democratic Party has enormous challenges and problems and flaws, and most of us have a love-hate relationship with it. It's like, you want to be active, but it's hard sometimes to get yourself fired up. Who's the leader? Who's really running the show? It's an amorphous, disorganized group quite often. So a lot of your criticism, I have no doubt, are valid. Yes, ma'am. Hey, Patricia.
Would you talk for a minute about the rainy day fund and what our legislative leaders would consider a rainy day?
Not very much, I don't think. I mean, not just the rainy day fund. We have an enormous surplus right now, thanks in large part to the much faster than anticipated recovery of the economy, thanks in large part to the enormous economic recovery packages passed, both even during the end of the Trump years and especially during the first 2 years of the Biden administration. The North Carolina state budget has we have billions of dollars in the bank. And that's what in particular makes so outrageous the fact that they're unwilling to fund this education plan that wouldn't even really put that much of a dent in the ginormous $6 billion that we got just sitting around. It's just, I think ultimately it bespeaks this really deep ideological passion that drives so many folks on the other side, on the far right. Art Pope, as you all probably know, Art, who funds the John Locke Foundation and all those groups, and he's big with Americans for Prosperity. And when I came here, he was a state legislator running for lieutenant governor. It's hard to remember, back in the early 90s. The groups that he fund, they are true believers on this stuff. They still buy into this sort of ultra reactionary libertarian anti-government point of view, that anything that is public is just by definition flawed and bad, and that anything that is quote unquote private, is good. And it infects so many of and they are, for lack of probably any better alternative, sort of the intellectual hub of the right in North Carolina. I guess Trumpism is to a certain extent replaced even that, with just this incoherent conservatism, but they really genuinely just see, anything they can do to cut down the size of government. The old Grover Norquist, let's get government down to the size we can drown it in a bathtub. They believe that, and it is reflected in the way they deal with the rainy day fund, or just the surpluses in general that we've accumulated, and their unwillingness to fund public services.
Sir, I haven't been in the state very long, a couple of years, so I may be speaking from ignorance.
Yeah.
But to me, a Democrat, the Governor Cooper, and the State Attorney General, Josh Stein, seem to be the leaders. But could you comment on their role as they try, especially the governor, try to maneuver around the state legislature?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I remember actually seeing, it's funny, I used to, as I said, I spent many years lobbying in the General Assembly. I remember when Governor Cooper was a young senator. I remember one of my first days on the job, one of my colleagues had to get their traffic ticket fixed in Nash County, and we went to go see this young lawyer legislator named Roy Cooper to see if he could do anything about it. And he said, "Oh yeah, for another lawyer, I'll be taking care of that for you." And then when I was chair of the board of the state ACLU, and Deborah Ross was our executive director, and I had to write her evaluation, I went to go talk to Senator Cooper to see what he thought of this lobbyist we had, Deborah Ross. And here they are. She's in Congress and he's the governor. I mean, I think Roy Cooper is a really good guy. I mean, in his heart, he really wants to do the right thing. He's a pragmatic politician. He's got an incredibly difficult job. I'm sure I don't agree with him completely, as I'm sure none of us would on every single issue, but by and large, he's really done a pretty darn good job, sort of like Joe Biden. I disagree with some of his stances. I think sometimes he's been too pragmatic. I was disappointed that he was willing to agree to the state budget that they signed last year. I think he believed deep in his heart he was going to get this Medicaid expansion if he agreed to it. I think he still thinks maybe that's going to happen this year. It was a very difficult, he hasn't had many cards to play since he's been in this job. And Josh Stein is a brilliant, I want to say young man. He's not so young anymore. I think Josh is in his 50s now. Josh has done a fine job as Attorney General. He too, I remember when they brought him in as this young director of the Office of Consumer Protection, and we thought, who is this guy? And he's just obvious, sometimes the cream just rises. Josh Stein's going to run for governor. It's going to be a remarkable race, y'all. I'm sure you all are paying attention to what we're about to confront in this state. It's hard to imagine. I think the Republicans would like to get rid of Mark Robinson. I think they would like to figure out some way to put him somewhere else, to get him to run for a congressional seat. I wouldn't put it past them. They're going to redraw the congressional maps. This 7-7 stuff ain't going to last. They're going to go right back to drawing maps this year that are 10-4 or 11-3. I'm sure they haven't gotten rid of the idea of trying to find a seat for Robinson somewhere else. But I don't think Dale Folwell is going to beat him in a Republican primary. It's hard to imagine who else would. And that's going to be pretty frightening to have that man anywhere close to a position of genuine authority in the state, because he is a deeply troubled and confused soul. So Josh Stein, Mark Robinson race, going to get a lot of national attention in 2024, along with, I guess, God knows what the presidential race will look like. Yes, sir.
I moved to Farrington Village about a year ago, and I'm fascinated by the Chatham County, the story of Chatham County. Largely rural county, went 56% Democratic. Very interesting mix of people in the region, but at the same time, it's about to undergo a tremendous transformation, both economically and in population. So I'm wondering what you think about Chatham's role in the future of politics in this state, taking all of that into account.
Yeah, well, it's going to grow, right? You all are going to have an awful lot more people and a lot more development coming fast. Lisa Sorg has written about, in particular, some of the real environmental challenges Chatham is going to face with rapid development, and whether the infrastructure that exists or even that is contemplated is going to be able to handle the kind of growth that's contemplated. But I guess really it's fair to say that the growth that Chatham is going to experience reflects really the transformation that's happening to the state. The reality is that North Carolina has been booming for years, but half its counties have been losing population and jobs for years. The population has been moving to the, I-40-85 corridor from Wake County down to Mecklenburg County. And I guess you'd consider Chatham County an appendage of that. So I guess the best thing to think about it is to try to look optimistically at it and think about the fact that our state is becoming rapidly more diverse, rapidly more urbanized. That figures in the long run to make us more like Virginia, to make us more likely to be a state that is forward-looking rather than backward-looking, to diminish ultimately at some point the clout of rural reactionary lawmakers. It's unfortunately taking longer than I think a lot of us had hoped, but I think Chatham will be a part of that. And I'm sure we'll be writing a lot of stories, particularly about the environmental impacts of all this development that's going to be happening here. Yes, ma'am.
The NNO has had exposés about the poultry industry and the hog industry. They're horrible. And it seems that our government, no matter Democratic or Republican, haven't done anything about reining them in, whereas even states like South Carolina have put restrictions on the damage that is done in their state. What happened?
Well, we had a moratorium that North Carolina enacted about 20 years ago on new hog farms, but obviously it's not just the expansion of it, it is the reality of what industrial, concentrated animal feeding stations represent. And there's a difference of opinion, I guess it's fair to say. There are many people in America who remain untroubled by the sheer horror of the experience that is inflicted on animals and the horror, that not to mention the environmental impact of having, the hard cold reality is that a full grown hog puts out 3 times the waste of a human every day. And if you have hundreds of thousands of them located in a particular area, there's just nothing to be done with the waste. It's a huge, huge crisis. Yeah. Well, I think there would be an effort if the Democrats were, anywhere near in control of the General Assembly. I think you could rest assured. It's just, I saw where you're going to have Marcia Moray come talk next month. Representative Marcia Moray from Durham County. She is the former chief district court judge of Durham County, the preeminent voice for sane gun violence policy in our state. She's been arguing for simple, basic gun violence laws for years. And there are people on the Ag Committee, Democrats. Pricey Harrison, who's a lawmaker from Greensboro, has been arguing for the kinds of things that you've identified for years. She just doesn't have any clout. She doesn't have any power. The Democrats are not just a minority, but a truly toothless, powerless minority in the General Assembly right now. They're not even, their bills aren't considered. They're not told when the meetings are going to happen. They're not, it's a very bad situation for them. It's a tough job. You got to have a lot of guts just to go do it. And it takes a lot of courage to just be in the minority on the floor of the House and stand up and get outvoted every time. So I think it would be different. I think they would pursue different policies. We've seen also a transformation in the Democratic Party. When I came here in 1992, there were a lot of very deeply conservative rural Democrats, just because of the history of, this being a one-party state. Obviously there was a time when Democrats were the party of white supremacy and racism in this state. There's been a remarkable transformation how the parties have kind of swapped identities to a certain extent. There was a period there where that sort of overlapped for a while, but for now, right now, the Democrats I think they would, but they're just not in a position to do a whole lot. And the Cooper administration tries through their Department of Environmental Quality to do some of that stuff, but they have very limited, they have very few cards to play. It's tough. It's a bad situation. California has passed this law on the conditions in which hogs are actually kept. And that's worked its way to the Supreme Court. It's being challenged, that they don't want to even have that restriction on the conditions in which these animals are raised and bread. It's tough stuff. Painful to contemplate.
So
The website is ncpolicywatch.com. If you check them, and you also may want to check out newsfromthestates.com, news from the states, because that's where all the news from all the states' newsroom outlets are compiled every day, and it's changing all day long with national news headlines. But we'd hope you go to ncpolicywatch.com first, maybe, and check us out. And again, we'll be happy to fill up your inbox. I know you don't get any email, you don't have anything in your inboxes, but we'd send you a couple a day just so you stay up. And we actually also, every morning, my colleague Clayton Hinkle, who produces my radio show and the radio commentaries I do on Mix 101. She gets up at 5 o'clock every morning and curates all the news headlines and puts them in a handy email that you get every morning at 8 o'clock on a weekday. So hope you'll check that out. And yeah, check out our radio. We have a fun radio show and do those radio commentaries every night. I in a weird kind of cool way, I have Jesse Helms' old job. Jesse Helms, those of you old enough to remember Jesse Helms, of course, the infamous Senator No from North Carolina, who came to fame doing the nightly commentary on the WRAL News Channel 5 in Raleigh. Well, at least on the Mix 101 simulcast version of the Channel 5 news every night, it's a 1-minute commentary from me. So I take some solace in the fact that I sort of have, yeah, I don't want to be a senator, but it's kind of cool that, I think maybe that's a small sign of progress in the world. But yeah,
So-
too long.
this is either the last question or the next to last question, depending on if anybody has one more. But I wonder if you could briefly explain where things stand in terms of the photo ID requirement in order to vote, and what the election of all those Republicans to the state Supreme Court
Yeah.
might mean for the future.
Geez, talk about burying the lead here, right? Yes, that's been a dispute in North Carolina for a long time and around the country as to whether we would have a mandatory voter ID requirement to vote. There have been attempts by the Republicans to enact that. It's been struck down by the courts. In 2018, they placed an amendment on the ballot in a very hasty fashion that really didn't say what it would, what the details would be. It was passed by the voters. They then passed a law in an effort to sort of implement that rather vague constitutional amendment that really didn't even apprise voters of what the hell it was they were voting for. The state Supreme Court struck it down and said that it's unconstitutional. Now we have the Republicans, interestingly enough, I wrote a column about it today, went to the Supreme Court last Friday and said, the Republicans are in charge now. You guys need to reverse what the Democratic majority did in December, which would be, when it comes to constitutional jurisprudence, a pretty remarkable step. That's pretty gutsy. That doesn't happen much in constitutional law, where just because we've had a changeover of the composition of a court that we would immediately reverse a decision we made a month ago. It took 49 years to reverse Roe versus Wade. Plessy versus Ferguson took 56 years. So we'll see. But there's no doubt that Republicans have not given up on this front. And even if they didn't get that decision reversed, they would almost surely try again to pass a voter ID requirement. The irony, of course, here is that if there is fraud in voting, it's in absentee ballots, right? Which is where the Republican operative did that in the 9th congressional district a few years ago, and where Republicans probably vote more than Democrats historically. So it's sort of ironic, but there will be another push. Right now, voter ID is not required in our state, but it seems likely that they'll try again, just as they'll try again with gerrymandering, and with a new conservative Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, it seems likely they'll find a much more receptive audience for those efforts. So it's something that it may be that we'll be in a situation where we'll just have to make our best of it and do our best to make sure that everybody has an ID that needs one when the time comes. And so sorry to leave you on that bummer of a note. But
Is there a final question? Anybody? No, of information. They're saying.
Thank you so much for being here, and for those who stuck with us online. And you guys are going to love Lisa Sorg when she comes to talk to you in March. And thanks.
We're going to
call
put
me, send me an email anytime. I think I do. I'll make sure you have it written.
We're going to put a link to NC Policy Watch on the website of the Farrington Democratic Club, along with the link to the recording of this talk. Okay. And I think we should have him once a year. What do you think?